The morning of the reading, I chose the black Chanel suit Harrison had bought me for our 30th anniversary. It felt right somehow, wearing something he'd given me to the meeting that would divide everything he'd left behind. 3 weeks since the funeral, and I was still discovering new ways grief could ambush me. This time, it was the faint trace of his cologne still lingering in my closet, hitting me the moment I opened the doors. I'm Eleanora Blackwell, 58 years old, widow, as of 23 days ago. And in approximately 2 hours, I was supposed to sit in a Manhattan law office and listen to strangers tell me what my husband had decided to do with 35 years of shared life. I applied my lipstick with steady hands. That was something Harrison always admired about me. "You never shake, Nora," he used to say. "Even when the world is falling apart, your hands stay steady." I wondered what he would think of me now, putting on armor made of cashmere and pearls to face whatever his death had set in motion. The car was waiting when I came downstairs. A black Lincoln, appropriately somber, arranged by Vivian last week when she'd offered to help with logistics. My daughter-in-law had been exceptionally helpful since Harrison's death. Suspiciously helpful, if I'm being honest. But I'd kept that thought to myself, filed away in the same mental drawer where I'd stored 4 years of observations about the woman my son had married. The driver was new, not Marcus, who'd driven our family for 15 years before being abruptly dismissed 8 months ago. This was someone younger, unfamiliar, wearing a cap pulled low over his forehead. Vivian had hired him, she'd said. More reliable, she'd explained, though she'd never adequately explained what Marcus had done that was so unreliable. I walked toward the car, my heels clicking against the stone path that wound through our Greenwich estate. The October morning was crisp, the kind of perfect autumn day Harrison would have insisted on spending outdoors. I was reaching for the door handle when I heard it, running footsteps, heavy, desperate, crashing through the hedges that lined the eastern property boundary. I turned, and for a moment I didn't recognize him. The beard was longer, graying and unkempt. The clothes were charity store cast-offs, nothing like the pressed uniform he'd worn for a decade and a half. But the eyes, those pale blue eyes that had watched over our family through countless drives to airports, hospitals, celebrations, and crises. Those I would recognize anywhere. "Mrs. Blackwell," Marcus was shouting, his voice hoarse with urgency. "Mrs. Blackwell, don't get in that car." The driver started to move toward him, but I held up my hand. Something in Marcus's face stopped me cold. This wasn't the expression of a man seeking money or attention. This was terror. "Ma'am, we should go," the driver said. "This man is clearly disturbed. I'll call security." But Marcus kept coming, stumbling the last few feet until he was close enough that I could see the trembling in his hands. "Please," he gasped. "Your daughter-in-law. The mechanic. I saw him working under the car yesterday. The brake lines. Please, Mrs. Blackwell, you have to believe me." The world seemed to slow down. I looked at Marcus, at his desperate eyes. I looked at the driver, whose hand had moved toward his pocket in a way that suddenly seemed less about a phone and more about something else entirely. I thought about Vivian's newfound helpfulness, about Harrison's death, so sudden, so unexpected, about the way my daughter-in-law's eyes had flickered with something cold when she'd asked which car I'd be taking to the reading. "Thank you for your concern," I said to the driver, my voice remarkably calm. "But I've just remembered I prefer to arrange my own transportation. You can tell whoever hired you that I won't be needing the car after all." His expression shifted. Just for a second, but I saw it. Frustration, perhaps even fear. "Ma'am, Mrs. Blackwell arranged this specifically. She'll be upset if I return without taking you." "Then she'll have to be upset." I pulled out my phone. "I'm calling a taxi. You're dismissed." The driver hesitated for a long moment. I watched his calculation, saw him weighing options. Then he got back in the Lincoln and drove away, tires crunching on the gravel just a bit too quickly to be casual. I turned to Marcus. "Tell me everything." What he told me, standing in the morning chill of my own driveway, was the foundation of a nightmare I hadn't known I was living in. 8 months ago, Marcus had walked in on Vivian in Harrison's study, going through financial documents. When he'd reported it to her, not understanding the implications, she'd smiled and said she was just organizing things for my husband. But the next week, she'd accused Marcus of stealing jewelry from her room. jewelry that had, conveniently, been found in his car. "I never took anything, Mrs. Blackwell," he said, his voice cracking. "You know me. 15 years. I never took a single thing." I did know him. That was what had bothered me most about the whole situation, the part I'd swallowed because Julian had asked me to let it go. Vivienne was humiliated, my son had said. Can we just move past it? And I had. Because keeping peace with my son mattered more than justice for a man I'd trusted implicitly. That choice haunted me now. Marcus told me he'd been watching the house from a distance ever since Harrison's death. Not in a threatening way. He'd been worried about me. He'd seen the way Vivienne looked at me when she thought no one was watching. And yesterday, he'd seen a man he recognized from his own troubled past. An ex-convict who specialized in making automotive accidents happen, working underneath the Lincoln that had just been waiting for me. "The brake lines," he repeated. "I'd bet my life on it. She wanted it to look like an accident." I stood there in my Chanel suit, my lipstick perfect, my hands finally beginning to shake. Harrison, always so healthy, dying suddenly of a heart attack. My car, sabotaged. The reading of the will, scheduled for today. It didn't take a forensic accountant to connect these dots, and before I'd built my consulting firm, a forensic accountant was exactly what I'd been. "Marcus, I need you to wait here. No, actually, I need you to go to the greenhouse and wait there. The gardening staff won't arrive until noon. I'm going to make some calls, and then I'm going to that reading. But first, I need to understand exactly what I'm walking into." He grabbed my arm, gentle but insistent. "You can't go there. If she finds out the car didn't work, she'll try something else. She won't try anything in a room full of lawyers and witnesses." I met his eyes. "But I need to see her face when I walk through that door. I need to know for certain. Do you understand?" He didn't want to. I could see the protective instinct warring with recognition of my determination. Finally, he nodded. "Go to the greenhouse," I repeated. "I'll send someone for you. And Marcus, I'm sorry. I should have fought harder for you 8 months ago. I knew something was wrong, and I let it go to keep the peace. That ends today." The taxi took 45 minutes to arrive. I used every minute of it. First, I called my personal attorney, Diana Chen, not Preston Walsh, who'd been Harrison's lawyer for 30 years. Diana was mine alone, someone I'd worked with during my consulting days, someone whose loyalty I'd never had cause to question. I gave her a brief summary of what Marcus had told me and asked her to meet me at Preston's office. Second, I called a private investigator I'd used years ago, Thomas Riley, during a complex fraud case. I asked him to run a quiet background check on Vivienne Marchand Blackwell, focusing on her finances for the past 2 years. Third, and this was the call that cost me the most, I phoned Detective Dinah Cross at the Greenwich Police Department. I'd contacted her a week after Harrison's funeral, driven by an instinct I couldn't articulate, asking if there was any possibility of further examining the circumstances of my husband's death. She'd been kind but non-committal. Now I told her what Marcus had seen, and her tone changed entirely. "Don't go to that meeting," she said. "I have to. Mrs. Blackwell, if what you're telling me is true, you're in danger. I'm aware, but I need to see her reaction, and I need to be present for the reading of my husband's will. Whatever is in it, whatever she's been planning around it, I have to know." There was a long pause. "I'll send someone to the address. Plain clothes, they'll wait in the lobby. Do not leave the building without checking in with me first." I agreed. Then I sat in the back of the taxi and watched Connecticut turn into New York, and I tried to prepare myself for what I was about to do. Preston Walsh's office occupied the 17th floor of a building on Park Avenue. The elevator ride gave me 90 seconds to compose myself. I thought about Harrison, about the 35 years we'd built together. I thought about Julian, my only child, and wondered how deeply he was entangled in whatever his wife had done. That was the question that hurt most. Had my son been part of a plan to kill his own father? To kill me? I couldn't believe it. Wouldn't believe it until I saw proof. Julian was weak, I knew that much. He'd always been too easily influenced, too eager for approval, especially from those who withheld it. His father had been sparing with praise, and Julian had spent his whole life chasing it. But murder? Conspiracy to murder his own mother? No. Whatever Vivienne had done, I had to believe my son was ignorant of it. The alternative was unthinkable. The receptionist guided me to the conference room. I was 15 minutes early, which was exactly what I'd intended. Preston Walsh rose to greet me, his face carefully arranged in an expression of professional sympathy. He was a good man, I'd always thought. Honest, if perhaps too cautious. He'd served Harrison well for 3 decades. "Eleonora, how are you holding up?" "As well as can be expected." I sat in the chair he offered. "Preston, I need to see the will before the others arrive." He hesitated. "That's not typically how these things are done." "I'm aware, but I'm asking you, as Harrison's widow and as someone who has trusted your firm for over 30 years, to make an exception." Something in my tone must have communicated the urgency I felt. Preston studied me for a long moment, then nodded. He retrieved a folder from his desk and handed it to me. What I read made my blood run cold. Harrison had left 70% of his estate to me, 20% to a charitable foundation we'd discussed creating together, only 10% to Julian, with a stipulation that the funds be placed in a trust administered by an independent financial advisor of my choosing. But it was the final clause that stopped my breath. If I were to die before the official reading and registration of the will, the entire distribution would be frozen and subjected to a 6-month independent audit. During that time, no funds would be released to anyone except for basic maintenance of properties and ongoing business operations. My husband, brilliant man that he was, had anticipated something. He'd built a safeguard into his final wishes. If I died before today, Vivian would receive nothing for 6 months. Long enough for questions to be asked, long enough for investigations to be conducted, long enough for a desperate woman with mounting debts to be destroyed by her creditors. "Preston," I said quietly, "did Harrison ever express concerns to you about anyone in the family? About their intentions?" The lawyer's face told me everything before he spoke. He was worried. In the months before he died, he mentioned wanting to restructure some protections. He used the phrase, "inappropriate influences." He never specified who he meant, but I understood. "Why didn't you tell me?" "He asked me not to. He said he wanted to handle it himself, in his own way. And then," Preston trailed off, "and then he died before he could protect me properly." "I need you to tell me about the circumstances of Marcus Donovan's termination," I said. "Everything you know." Preston's expression shifted to confusion. "The driver? He was let go for theft. Your daughter-in-law found jewelry in his possession." Did Harrison believe that? No. The admission came slowly. Harrison was furious about it, actually. He was investigating, trying to find out what really happened. He believed Marcus had been set up, and then he died. I heard voices in the outer office, Julian's nervous tenor, and beneath it, Vivian's practiced calm. They were here. "Preston, I need you to trust me. Something is very wrong, and I need to see how the next few minutes unfold. Whatever happens, I need you to keep this meeting going. Can you do that?" He nodded, though I could see the questions multiplying in his eyes. The door opened. Julian came in first, looking tired and anxious. He'd aged in the 3 weeks since his father's funeral, and despite everything, my heart ached for him. He was my son. Whatever else was true, he was my child, and I loved him. "Mom," he kissed my cheek. "How are you? You look beautiful. Dad would have loved that suit." "Thank you, sweetheart." I searched his eyes for guilt, for complicity, and found only grief and stress. Whatever Vivian had done, I was increasingly certain Julian was ignorant of it. Willfully ignorant, perhaps, but not an active participant. And then Vivian walked in. She was dressed impeccably, as always. A charcoal gray dress that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly salary had been. Pearls at her throat that I suspected were gifts from Julian, bought with Blackwell money. Her blonde hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, and her makeup was flawless. But I wasn't looking at her clothes or her hair. I was looking at her eyes. She was smiling as she entered, that practiced expression of sympathetic concern she'd worn since Harrison's death. "Eleonora, darling, how are you? The car got there on time, I hope. I was so worried about the traffic." I let her get 3 steps into the room before I stood. Our eyes met. I watched her process my presence. I watched her realize that I was here, alive, standing in front of her when I should have been scattered across a Connecticut highway. I watched her calculations crumble, her careful plans dissolve, her mask slip for just a fraction of a second. But that fraction of a second was enough. Her face went white. Not pale, not flushed. White, like all the blood had drained out of her at once. Her pupils dilated with pure, animal fear. Her perfectly painted lips parted, but no sound came out. And then her eyes rolled back in her head, and Vivian Marchand Blackwell collapsed onto Preston Walsh's antique Persian rug. In that moment, before anyone rushed to help her, before Julian cried out in shock, before the chaos erupted, I knew. I knew with absolute certainty that my daughter-in-law had tried to kill me this morning. And I knew with equal certainty that she had killed my husband. The game was no longer hers. It was mine now, and I intended to win. The chaos that followed Vivian's collapse gave me time to think. Julian was on his knees beside her, loosening the collar of her dress, calling her name with genuine panic in his voice. Preston had rushed to get water. His assistant was asking if she should call an ambulance. I stood perfectly still and watched my daughter-in-law's eyelids flutter. She wasn't unconscious. I'd seen enough boardroom negotiations to recognize a tactical retreat when I witnessed one. Vivian was buying time, recalculating, trying to figure out her next move. But the damage was done. That split second of pure terror before she went down had told me everything I needed to know. Give her some air, I said, my voice calm. She's probably just overwhelmed. The stress of the past few weeks has been hard on all of us. Julian looked up at me with gratitude, and I felt a familiar ache in my chest. My son, my only child. How had we gotten here? I remember the day he was born like it was yesterday. 23 hours of labor, and then this perfect, red-faced creature was placed in my arms. Harrison cried. The only time I ever saw him cry actually, until 35 years later when he held my hand on our anniversary and told me I was the best decision he ever made. Julian was a sensitive child. Too sensitive, Harrison always said, though I argued that sensitivity wasn't a weakness. He felt things deeply, our son. When the family dog died, Julian didn't speak for 3 days. When a classmate was cruel to him in 4th grade, he developed stomach problems that lasted for months. He absorbed the emotions of everyone around him, which made him kind, but also made him vulnerable. I should have been there more. That's the truth I've never been able to escape. When Julian was growing up, I was building my consulting firm from nothing. 12-hour days, sometimes 14. Business trips that stretched into weeks. I told myself it was for him, for his future, for the opportunities my hard work would provide. But children don't need opportunities. They need presence. And I wasn't present enough. Harrison tried to fill the gap, but he was building his own empire. The Blackwell family had money going back 3 generations, but Harrison wanted to multiply it, prove himself worthy of the legacy. So Julian grew up in a beautiful home with every material advantage and 2 parents who loved him desperately but were rarely there to show it. We sent him to boarding school in Switzerland when he was 12. It was what families like ours did, we told ourselves. The best education, the right connections, a path to success. But I still remember his face when we dropped him off. 12 years old, trying so hard to be brave, his lower lip trembling just slightly as he hugged me goodbye. I should have turned the car around. I should have taken him home and figured out another way. Instead, I told myself he would adjust, he would thrive, he would thank us one day. He never thanked us, and something in him closed off during those years away. When he came home for holidays, he was polite but distant. The sensitive little boy who had cried over a dead dog had learned to armor himself. He'd learned that love was conditional, that presence was not guaranteed, that the only person he could truly rely on was himself. Except that wasn't true either. Julian never learned to rely on himself. He learned to rely on whoever would give him the approval he craved. First it was teachers and coaches, then friends and girlfriends, then Harrison, whose validation he chased desperately and never quite caught. And finally, 4 years ago, it was Vivian. I remember the day he brought her home to meet us. She was beautiful in that sharp, careful way that some women cultivate like a weapon. Blonde hair, green eyes, cheekbones that could cut glass. She smiled at all the right moments and said all the right things, and I watched my son gaze at her like she'd hung the moon. Harrison was charmed. That surprised me at the time, though it shouldn't have. Vivian was exactly the kind of woman who knew how to charm powerful men. She asked Harrison about his business interests with seemingly genuine curiosity. She complimented my jewelry with just the right amount of admiration. She navigated our family dynamics like she'd studied a playbook. Because she had, I realized later. She'd done her research before ever setting foot in our home. After dinner, while Julian was showing Vivian the garden, Harrison poured me a brandy and said, "She's perfect for him." I didn't agree, but I didn't say so. Instead, I asked, "What do we know about her family?" "Rhode Island, I think. Old money that got unlucky." Harrison shrugged. "Does it matter? Julian is happy. When's the last time we saw him this happy?" He had a point. Julian was glowing in a way I hadn't seen since childhood. Every time Vivian looked at him, my son stood a little taller. Every time she touched his arm, he leaned into it like a flower toward the sun. I should have been happy for him. Instead, I felt a cold knot in my stomach that I couldn't explain. Over the following months, I tried to get to know my future daughter-in-law. We had lunch in the city. We went shopping together. I asked about her childhood, her interests, her dreams for the future. And every time, I came away with the same unsettling feeling. Vivian was performing. Every smile was calculated. Every anecdote was polished. Every emotional moment was perfectly timed for maximum effect. I told Harrison my concerns once, just once. His response was gentle, but firm. "You're looking for problems because you're scared of losing Julian. She's not taking him away from you, Nora. She's making him happy. Try to be happy for him." So I tried. I smiled at their engagement party. I helped plan the wedding, deferring to Vivian's preferences even when they seemed excessive. I welcomed her into the family with every outward sign of warmth I could muster. And I watched. I watched her spend money with abandon, always on credit cards that Julian paid off without complaint. I watched her manipulate my son with subtle guilt and strategic affection. I watched her insert herself into family financial discussions, asking questions about trusts and investments and inheritance structures with an interest that seemed academic but felt predatory. I watched, and I said nothing, because keeping the peace seemed more important than speaking the truth. That silence cost me my husband. Harrison's death came without warning. One morning he was having breakfast and talking about a golf game he had planned for the weekend. By that afternoon, he was gone. Massive heart attack, the doctors said. Sometimes these things happen, even to healthy men in their early 60s. A hidden weakness in the heart, a blood clot that came from nowhere, a body that simply stopped. I accepted that explanation because the alternative was unthinkable. My husband was dead, and I was drowning in grief, and I couldn't afford to question the nature of my loss. There was a funeral to plan, a family to hold together, a life to somehow rebuild from the wreckage, but doubt crept in around the edges. Harrison had just completed a comprehensive cardiac screening 2 months before his death. Clean bill of health, the cardiologist had said. Heart of a man 10 years younger. No warning signs, no concerns, no hidden weaknesses. In the weeks before he died, Harrison had been preoccupied with something he wouldn't discuss. Late nights in his study, hushed phone calls, meetings with Preston that he didn't mention until afterward. When I asked, he said he was reorganizing some things. Protections, he called them, for the family's future. I didn't push. I trusted that Harrison would tell me when he was ready. That was always our way. 35 years of marriage had taught us when to probe and when to give each other space. Now I understood what those protections had been. He'd seen something in Vivian that alarmed him. He'd tried to build safeguards into his will, provisions that would prevent her from accessing the family fortune if something happened to me. He'd even started investigating the false accusations against Marcus, suspecting that Vivian had set up our driver to remove someone who might have witnessed something she didn't want seen. Harrison had been connecting the same dots I was connecting now, and it had killed him. The thought was almost too painful to bear. My husband, always so careful, always so strategic, had underestimated a predator in his own home. He'd tried to protect me, protect our family, and Vivian had eliminated him before he could finish the job. How had she done it? That question would haunt me until I found the answer. The medical examiner had found nothing unusual, but medical examiners only found what they were looking for, and no one had been looking for murder. Now, someone would be. As I watched Vivian slowly regain consciousness on Preston's floor, I made a silent promise to my husband. I would finish what he had started. I would expose the woman who had invaded our family, who had manipulated our son, who had taken Harrison from me before his time, and I would do it carefully, strategically, the way Harrison would have wanted. Vivian's eyes opened. She looked around with convincing confusion, then focused on Julian's worried face above her. What happened? Her voice was weak, trembling. Perfect performance. You fainted, Julian said. Are you okay? Should we call a doctor? No. She sat up slowly, pressing a hand to her forehead. I'm fine. Just the stress, I think. And I haven't been eating well since... She let the sentence trail off, implying that Harrison's death had affected her so deeply she couldn't even take care of herself. I wanted to applaud. It really was a masterful display. Perhaps we should postpone the reading, Preston suggested. If Mrs. Blackwell isn't well. No. Vivian's response was a bit too quick, a bit too sharp. She softened it immediately with a sad smile. Harrison would have wanted us to take care of this. I don't want to be the reason for any delays. I'm fine, really. Just give me a moment. Julian helped her to a chair. She kept her eyes carefully away from mine, focusing on arranging her dress, adjusting her pearls, doing all the small things a woman does when she's trying to appear composed. But I'd seen her face when she walked in. I'd seen the animal terror of a predator suddenly becoming prey. She knew that I knew, and she knew that everything was about to change. I took my seat at the conference table and waited for Preston to begin reading my husband's final wishes. The game was just beginning, and I intended to play it better than she ever could. Preston cleared his throat and opened the folder containing Harrison's will. The room had settled into an uncomfortable silence. Vivian perched on her chair with manufactured fragility. Julian, hovering beside her with concern, etched into every line of his face. I sat across from them, my hands folded in my lap, watching everything. Before I begin, Preston said, I want to remind everyone that Harrison updated this document approximately 6 weeks before his passing. These were his final and most current wishes. 6 weeks. That timing landed in my chest like a physical blow. 6 weeks ago, Harrison had still been alive, still been working to protect me from something he'd seen coming. And Vivian had stopped him before he could finish. I kept my expression neutral. Years of high-stakes negotiations had taught me the value of a still face. Preston began reading the standard legal preamble, the declarations of sound mind and body, the revocation of all previous wills. I watched Vivian from the corner of my eye. She was staring at Preston with intense focus, her fingers gripping the armrests of her chair just a bit too tightly. To my beloved wife, Eleanora Blackwell, I leave 70% of my total estate, including the Greenwich property, the Manhattan apartment, all investment portfolios in my name, and full ownership of Blackwell Holdings. Vivian's knuckles went white. To the Harrison and Eleanora Blackwell Foundation, a charitable organization to be established following my death for purposes my wife and I have previously discussed, I leave 20% of my total estate. Julian shifted in his seat. I could see him doing the math, realizing what was left. To my son, Julian Blackwell, I leave 10% of my total estate, to be held in trust and administered by an independent financial advisor of my wife's choosing, with distributions to be made at my wife's discretion based on demonstrated financial responsibility. The silence that followed was deafening. Julian's face had gone pale. 10%? Dad left me 10%? Julian, Preston said gently, your father loved you very much, but he had concerns about certain influences in your life. He wanted to ensure that your inheritance would be protected and used wisely. Certain influences? Vivian's voice was sharp now, the weak and trembling facade cracking. What is that supposed to mean? I spoke for the first time since the reading began. It means exactly what it sounds like, Vivian. Harrison was worried about you. She turned to look at me, and for a moment, the mask slipped entirely. Behind the polished exterior, I saw something cold and calculating and utterly ruthless. Then it was gone, replaced by wounded confusion. Eleanora, I don't understand. I've never been anything but devoted to this family. Why would Harrison think, perhaps because he was investigating the circumstances of Marcus Donovan's termination? I said calmly. Perhaps because he discovered that the jewelry you claimed was stolen had actually been planted in Marcus's car. Perhaps because he was starting to understand exactly what kind of person his son had married. Julian stood up so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor. "Mom, what are you talking about? Marcus was fired because he stole from us. Vivian was devastated about it. Vivian was the only one who saw him take anything. And isn't it convenient that the one person who spent more time in this family than almost anyone else, the one person who might have noticed things he shouldn't have noticed, was removed so efficiently? This is insane." Vivian shook her head, her voice rising. "Julian, your mother is clearly struggling with her grief. She needs help, not accusations." "I agree that I need help," I said, "which is why I've already contacted the police." The room went very still. Preston looked at me with alarm, Julian looked at me with confusion, and Vivian looked at me with pure, undisguised hatred that lasted only a fraction of a second before she covered it with tearful distress. "The police? Eleonora, what could you possibly have told them?" "I told them about the man who tried to warn me not to get in my car this morning. I told them about the ex-convict who was seen working on that car yesterday. And I told them that I believe my husband's death deserves a second look." Julian stepped toward me, his face twisted with emotion. "Mom, Dad died of a heart attack. The doctors said so. You can't possibly think that Vivian had something to do with it. She's my wife. She loved Dad." "Did she? Or did she love what your father represented? Access to money, social standing, a lifestyle she couldn't afford on her own." Vivian was crying now, beautiful tears sliding down her cheeks without smudging her mascara. "I can't believe this. I can't believe you would say these things about me. Julian, please make her stop." "Mom," Julian's voice was pleading, "you need to stop this. Vivian has been nothing but supportive since Dad died. She's the one who arranged the funeral, who handled all the details, who made sure everything ran smoothly so you could grieve in peace." "Yes," I said quietly. "She's been very helpful. She arranged the car that was supposed to take me to this meeting. The car that Marcus Donovan, our former driver who she had fired under false pretenses, saw being tampered with yesterday." Julian faltered. I could see doubt beginning to creep into his eyes, and it broke my heart to put it there. But he needed to see the truth. "Marcus is homeless and mentally unstable," Vivian said quickly. "Everyone knows that. He's been stalking the family ever since he was fired. You can't possibly believe anything he says. Marcus is homeless because you destroyed his reputation with false accusations. He lost his job, his references, his ability to work in his profession. He's been watching over us because he's loyal, because he cared about this family more than you ever have. This is ridiculous." Vivian stood up, smoothing her dress with hands that trembled slightly. "I refuse to sit here and be accused of crimes by a grieving widow who's clearly lost touch with reality. Julian, we're leaving." But Julian didn't move. He was looking at me with something I hadn't seen in years, the uncertainty of a child who suspects he's been lied to but doesn't want to believe it. My heart ached for him. He'd spent 4 years building a life with this woman, trusting her, defending her, choosing her over his own instincts and his mother's unspoken concerns. "Julian," I said gently, "I'm not asking you to choose between us. I'm asking you to look at the facts. Your father was investigating Vivian before he died. He changed his will to protect the family assets from her influence. He built in safeguards in case something happened to me before the will could be properly executed. Why would he do all of that if he didn't see something that worried him? Because he was paranoid." Vivian's voice was rising, losing its careful modulation. "He never liked me. He never thought I was good enough for his precious son. This is just more of the same judgment and suspicion I've faced from this family since the day Julian brought me home." "That's not true," Julian said weakly. "Dad liked you. He said you were perfect for me." "He said that at the beginning," I acknowledged, "before he started looking more closely, before he saw the credit card bills, the gambling websites, the debts that kept growing no matter how much money Julian gave you." Vivian's face went rigid. "I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? I have a private investigator looking into your finances right now. How much do you owe, Vivian? 800,000? 900? More?" The silence stretched between us like a wire pulled taut. Julian turned to his wife. "Vivian? What is she talking about?" "Nothing. She's lying. She's trying to destroy our marriage because she's always been jealous of what we have." I have bank records, I said quietly. At least, I will within the hour. My investigator is very thorough, so perhaps now would be a good time for honesty, while there's still a chance to salvage something from this situation. Vivian's mask was crumbling. I could see the calculations happening behind her eyes, the rapid assessment of which lies were still viable and which had been exposed. It was like watching a cornered animal decide whether to flee or fight. She chose to fight. Fine, she spat. Yes, I have some debts, but they're not as bad as you're making them sound. It's just some bad investments, some spending that got out of control. I was going to tell Julian eventually. I was working on a plan to pay everything back. With what money? I asked. You don't work. You have no income of your own. The only way you could pay off $900,000 in gambling debts would be to access the Blackwell fortune. And the only way to access it quickly enough to satisfy your creditors would be if something happened to me before I could execute Harrison's will as he intended. Julian was staring at his wife like he'd never seen her before. Gambling debts? Vivian, what is happening? It's not what she's making it sound like, Vivian said desperately. Yes, I got into some trouble with online betting. It started small, just a way to pass the time when you were working late. Then it grew, and I was too embarrassed to tell you. But I would never hurt anyone, especially not your father. I loved Harrison. You loved his money, I corrected. You loved the lifestyle, the access, the possibility of inheriting a fortune. And when Harrison started asking questions, started looking too closely at who you really were, you eliminated him. That's not true, Vivian was screaming now, all pretense of composure abandoned. I didn't kill anyone. The car, I don't know anything about the car. Someone is framing me. Marcus is framing me because he's angry about being fired. Marcus saw your mechanic. He recognized him from his own past. An ex-convict named Danny Fiorello, who specializes in making murders look like accidents. How do you know Danny Fiorello, Vivian? She had no answer. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Julian stepped back from his wife. The movement was small, just a few inches, but it spoke volumes. Vivian, who is Danny Fiorello? I don't know anyone by that name. That's strange, I said, because my investigator has already found records of 3 cash payments you made to a man by that name over the past 6 months. Small amounts, paid through money transfer services, difficult to trace unless you know where to look. I was bluffing. Thomas Riley hadn't found any such records yet. But I'd learned long ago that the best way to get a confession was to act like you already had proof. Guilty people tended to fill in the gaps themselves, and Vivian was very, very guilty. Those payments were for something else, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For what? Silence. Julian looked like a man whose world was collapsing. Vivian, please, just tell me the truth. Whatever it is, just tell me the truth. His wife looked at him with something that might have been genuine emotion. Fear, certainly. Perhaps even something like regret. But not love. I'd been watching Vivian for 4 years, and I'd never once seen her look at my son with real love. I made a mistake, she finally said. A terrible mistake. But I didn't kill Harrison. I swear to you, Julian, I didn't kill your father. What about the car? I pressed. The car that was supposed to take me to this meeting? The car that Marcus saw being sabotaged? Vivian's composure shattered completely. Tears were streaming down her face now. Real tears, not the beautiful performative kind she'd displayed earlier. These were ugly and desperate. I just wanted to scare you, she sobbed. I didn't want you dead. I just wanted to delay things, to buy some time. If you'd been in an accident, nothing serious, just enough to postpone the reading of the will, I could have figured something out. I could have found a way to fix everything, by accessing the estate while I was incapacitated. She didn't deny it. Julian made a sound I'd never heard from him before, something between a gasp and a sob. He stepped further away from his wife, his face twisted with horror and disbelief. You tried to kill my mother? No, I just said I didn't want her dead. Danny was only supposed to damage the brakes enough to cause a minor accident, something that would put her in the hospital for a few weeks, nothing more. Nothing more, I repeated flatly. Just a minor accident, just a few weeks in the hospital. Just a little tampering with brake lines that could easily have killed me or anyone else on the road. Preston Walsh stood up from his chair. His face was gray. I'm calling the police. They're already on their way, I said. Detective Dinah Cross should be arriving shortly. I spoke with her this morning. Vivian looked around the room like a trapped animal seeking escape. Her eyes landed on the door, on the window, on Julian. But there was nowhere to go and no one left to help her. Julian, please. She reached for him, but he recoiled from her touch. Please. You have to understand. I was desperate. The people I owe money to, they threatened me. They threatened to hurt me if I didn't pay. I didn't know what else to do. So you tried to hurt my mother instead. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. I just needed time. I just needed access to enough money to pay them off, and then everything would have been fine. And my father? Julian's voice was hollow. Did he just need to get out of the way, too? Vivian's face went blank. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, very quietly, I want a lawyer. That was as close to a confession as we were going to get. But it was enough. It was enough to confirm what I'd suspected, enough to give the police grounds to investigate further, enough to shatter the facade Vivian had maintained for 4 years. The door opened, and Detective Dinah Cross walked in. She was a tall woman in her mid-40s, with short gray-streaked hair and an expression of calm authority. Behind her was a uniformed officer. Vivian Marchand Blackwell? Detective Cross's voice was professional but not unkind. I need you to come with me. We have some questions about the death of Harrison Blackwell and an attempted sabotage of a vehicle this morning. Vivian didn't resist. She didn't say anything at all. She just stood there, tears still streaming down her face as the officer guided her toward the door. But before she left, she turned back to look at me, and in her eyes I saw something that made my blood run cold. Not defeat, not remorse, calculation. Even now, even caught, she was planning her next move. This isn't over, she said quietly. You think you've won, but you don't know everything. You don't know what Harrison was really doing in those final weeks. You don't know what he found out. What are you talking about? But Detective Cross was already leading her out, and Vivian went without another word. Julian collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands. I wanted to go to him, to comfort him the way I had when he was a child and the world had been cruel. But I stayed where I was. He needed time to process what had just happened. He needed space to grieve for the marriage he'd thought he had. And I needed to figure out what Vivian had meant. What had Harrison found out? What didn't I know? Preston came to stand beside me. His face was still pale, but his voice was steady. Eleonora, I think there's something else you should see. Harrison gave me a sealed envelope about a month before he died. He told me to give it to you only if something happened to him, and only after the reading of the will. He handed me a cream-colored envelope with my name written in Harrison's familiar handwriting. My hands trembled slightly as I took it. I'll give you some privacy, Preston said. He gestured for his assistant to take Julian to another room, and within moments, I was alone. I opened the envelope and began to read. My darling Nora, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and my worst fears have been confirmed. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for leaving you, and I'm sorry for what I'm about to tell you. I should have told you months ago, but I was trying to protect you. I see now that protection without information is just another form of control, and you deserve better than that. Vivian is not who she claims to be. I started investigating her 6 months ago, after Marcus came to me with concerns. He'd seen her going through my financial documents late at night when she thought everyone was asleep. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia. But Marcus has been with us for 15 years, and his instincts have never been wrong. What I found terrified me. Vivian Marchand is not from an old Rhode Island family that fell on hard times. Her real name is Victoria Marsh, and she grew up in a series of foster homes in New Jersey after her mother died of an overdose when she was 7. I'm not telling you this to judge her origins. I'm telling you because she lied about everything, and a person who builds their entire identity on lies cannot be trusted. Her first marriage, which she never mentioned to any of us, ended when her husband died in a car accident. He was a wealthy investment banker. She inherited everything. The police investigated, but found no evidence of foul play. Her second relationship, which also never came up in conversation, was with an elderly widower in Connecticut. He died of a heart attack 6 months after changing his will to include her. His children contested the will, but couldn't prove anything. I hired a private detective to dig deeper. What he found was a pattern. Vivian, or Victoria, or whatever her real name is, has been targeting wealthy men for at least 15 years. Most of them died. All of them left her money. I found my hands gripping the paper so tightly it was beginning to crease. My husband's handwriting blurred as tears filled my eyes, but I forced myself to keep reading. By the time I understood what we were dealing with, I realized I was already in danger. I changed my will immediately, building in safeguards to protect you. I started documenting everything I could find, and I began to suspect that Vivian knew I was on to her. The chest pains started 3 weeks ago. Mild at first, then worse. I went to Dr. Patterson, who found nothing wrong, but the symptoms continued. I've started to wonder if something is being added to my food or drink, something that wouldn't show up in a standard cardiac screening. If I'm right, and if I'm reading this situation correctly, I don't have much time. I've tried to prepare as much as I can. Preston has copies of all my research in a secure location. Marcus knows more than he's told you. Things I asked him to keep secret until the right moment. I'm sorry, my love. I'm sorry I brought this danger into our home by not seeing Vivian for what she was. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. And I'm sorry for leaving you to clean up my mess. But if anyone can take down Vivian Marchand Blackwell, it's you. I've watched you build an empire from nothing. I've watched you outmaneuver men who underestimated you at every turn. You are the strongest person I've ever known, and I have complete faith that you will finish what I started. The evidence is with Preston. Everything you need to prove what she is and what she's done. Use it. Destroy her. And then, when it's over, please try to forgive our son. Julian is weak, but he's not evil. He was manipulated by someone far more skilled than he could have recognized. He loves you, even if he doesn't always show it. I love you, Nora. I have loved you since the moment I saw you at that charity gala, standing alone by the window, completely unimpressed by everyone in the room. I knew then that I'd found someone extraordinary. 35 years later, I still believe I was the luckiest man alive. Take care of yourself. Take care of Julian. And make sure Vivian never hurts anyone again. Forever yours, Harrison. I don't know how long I sat there, holding that letter. Time seemed to stop. My husband had known. He'd known he was being murdered, and he'd spent his final weeks trying to protect me from the same fate. The grief I'd been holding at bay since his funeral crashed over me like a wave. I let myself cry, really cry, for the first time since the doctors had told me he was gone. I cried for Harrison, for the future we'd planned together, for the grandchildren he would never meet. I cried for my son, who had married a monster without knowing it. I cried for myself, for the danger I hadn't seen and the truth I hadn't wanted to face. But grief is a luxury I couldn't afford. Not yet. Not while Vivian was still breathing, still planning, still capable of hurting the people I loved. I wiped my eyes, folded the letter carefully, and placed it in my purse. Then I opened the door and asked Preston to come back in. You have Harrison's research, I said. It wasn't a question. Preston nodded. He looked shaken, as if he'd been doing his own processing while I read my husband's final words. He gave me everything about 2 weeks before he died, told me to keep it secure and give it to you if anything happened to him. I need to see it. All of it. Of course, he hesitated. Eleonora, the things in those files, they're disturbing. Are you sure you're ready? My husband was murdered. My daughter-in-law tried to kill me this morning. I don't have the luxury of not being ready. Preston went to his office safe and returned with a thick folder. I opened it and began to read. Police reports from other states, death certificates, financial records, photographs of Vivian with men I didn't recognize, men whose names appeared on the death certificates. Harrison had been thorough. He'd documented everything, cross-referenced dates and locations, built a case that any prosecutor would salivate over. This wasn't just evidence of what Vivian had done to him. This was evidence of a decade-long pattern of seduction, manipulation, and murder. I closed the folder and looked up at Preston. Call Detective Cross. Tell her I have something she needs to see. This wasn't just about justice for Harrison anymore. It was about every man Vivian had killed, every family she had destroyed, every life she had ruined in her relentless pursuit of money. She thought she was clever. She thought she had covered her tracks, but she hadn't counted on Harrison. And she certainly hadn't counted on me. The next 72 hours were the longest of my life. Detective Cross arrived within an hour of my call. I handed her Harrison's folder and watched her expression shift from professional interest to barely concealed shock as she flipped through the pages. When she finished, she looked at me with something like respect. Your husband was a thorough man. He was trying to protect his family. He just ran out of time. She took the folder and promised to be in touch. In the meantime, Vivian had been taken to the Greenwich police station for questioning. She'd lawyered up immediately, refusing to answer any questions about Harrison's death or the sabotaged car. But the evidence was mounting, and even the most expensive attorney couldn't explain away what Marcus had witnessed. I went home to an empty house that had never felt emptier. Julian had disappeared after the reading, not answering his phone, not responding to my messages. I understood. His entire world had collapsed in the space of an afternoon. He needed time to process the fact that the woman he'd loved, the woman he'd defended against his own mother's unspoken concerns, was a serial killer who had murdered his father and tried to murder his mother. That night, I couldn't sleep. I wandered through the rooms Harrison and I had shared for decades, touching objects he had touched, sitting in chairs where he had sat. His reading glasses were still on the nightstand. His robe still hung in the closet. The ghost of his cologne still lingered in the fabric. I found myself in his study, sitting at his desk, surrounded by the books and papers and photographs of a life well lived. On the wall was a picture from our wedding day, both of us young and foolish and completely unaware of what the future would bring. Beside it was a photo of Julian as a baby, then as a toddler, then as a gap-toothed 7-year-old missing his front teeth. Where had I gone wrong? How had I failed to protect my family from the predator who had walked through our front door with a smile and a carefully crafted story? The answer, I knew, was that I hadn't trusted my instincts. I had seen something wrong in Vivian from the beginning. I had felt the coldness behind her perfect facade, sensed the calculation beneath her charm. But I had kept silent because speaking up would have caused conflict, because Harrison seemed charmed by her, because Julian was happy, or seemed to be, and I didn't want to be the mother who couldn't accept her son's choice. That silence had cost me everything. My phone rang at 3 a.m. It was Detective Cross. "We found Danny Fiorello," she said without preamble. "He's agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced charges. He's confirming everything. Vivian hired him to tamper with the brake lines. She told him to make sure the damage was severe enough to cause a serious accident, preferably fatal." I closed my eyes. Hearing it confirmed was different from suspecting it. Worse somehow. "There's more," Detective Cross continued. "We've been in touch with police departments in 3 other states. The pattern your husband documented is being taken very seriously. They're reopening investigations into the deaths of 2 men Vivian was connected to. If the evidence holds up, she's looking at multiple murder charges across multiple jurisdictions. What about Harrison? The medical examiner is rerunning toxicology with an expanded panel. Based on your husband's letter and the pattern we're seeing, we're looking for substances that could induce cardiac arrest without showing up in a standard screening. It will take time, but if something's there, we'll find it." I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat in the darkness of my husband's study and waited for dawn. The next 2 days brought a steady stream of revelations. Thomas Riley, my investigator, confirmed the gambling debts and traced them to an illegal online betting operation with connections to organized crime. Vivian owed nearly $900,000 to people who didn't accept payment plans or excuses. She had been desperate, and desperate people do desperate things. Marcus came to the house the morning after the reading. I'd had clothes sent to the greenhouse where he'd been staying, and he looked more like the man I remembered, clean and dignified, despite everything he'd been through. "Mr. Blackwell came to see me about a week before he died," Marcus told me, sitting in the kitchen where he'd shared countless cups of coffee with the household staff over the years. "He apologized for not fighting harder when I was fired. Said he'd been investigating and he knew the truth. He asked me to keep watching over the family, even from a distance. Said he was worried something might happen to him." "Did he say what?" Marcus shook his head. "Just that he'd made some enemies, and he needed someone he could trust to look out for you. He gave me money, enough to survive on while I figured out my next move. I've been staying at the shelter on Maple Street, but I came by the house every few days to make sure everything looked normal. And that's how you saw the mechanic. Danny Fiorello." I recognized him from my time inside. Marcus looked away, and I remembered that he'd served 3 years for assault in his 20s, long before he'd come to work for us. Harrison had known about his record and hired him anyway, believing in second chances. Danny's specialty was making accidents happen. Car trouble, electrical fires, that kind of thing. When I saw him under your car, I knew something was wrong. You saved my life, Marcus. I should have done more. Should have gone to the police right away instead of just warning you. You did exactly what you needed to do. And I promise you, I'm going to make this right. The accusations against you will be cleared. Your reputation will be restored, and you'll have a job here for as long as you want one. For the first time since I'd known him, Marcus's eyes filled with tears. He didn't speak, just nodded, and I understood that words weren't necessary between us. On the third day, Detective Cross called again. The expanded toxicology had found traces of potassium chloride in Harrison's preserved blood samples. Not enough to raise flags in a standard screening, but enough to trigger a fatal cardiac event in combination with other factors. The medical examiner was officially changing the cause of death from natural to homicide. I sat down when she told me. Even though I'd known, even though Harrison's letter had confirmed my suspicions, hearing it made official was devastating. My husband had been murdered, poisoned slowly, carefully, by a woman who had eaten at our table and slept under our roof. We're charging Vivian with first-degree murder, Detective Cross said. The other jurisdictions are preparing their own charges. She's not getting out of this. What about Julian? Has anyone told him? I was hoping you might do that. He's been staying at a hotel in the city. Hasn't responded to our attempts to reach him. Of course he hadn't. My son was hiding from reality, hoping that if he ignored it long enough, it might change into something more bearable. I'd have to be the one to pull him back into the world. I found Julian at the Greenwich Harbor Inn, a small hotel near the water where he'd proposed to Vivian 3 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. He opened the door, looking like he hadn't slept or showered since I'd last seen him. His eyes were red, his clothes were wrinkled, and he smelled like whiskey. My heart broke for him, even as I steeled myself for what I had to say. "Can I come in?" He stepped aside without speaking. The room was a mess. Minibar bottles scattered across the desk, clothes thrown on every surface. Julian sat on the edge of the unmade bed and stared at the floor. "They found potassium chloride in Dad's blood," I said quietly. "The medical examiner is ruling it a homicide. Vivian is being charged with murder." Julian made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "Of course she is. Of course my wife murdered my father. Why wouldn't she? Everything else about my life is a lie. Why not that too?" "Julian, don't." He held up a hand. "Don't tell me it's going to be okay. Don't tell me I'll get through this. Don't tell me any of the things mothers are supposed to say, because none of them are true." I sat down beside him on the bed. "You're right. Nothing about this is okay, and I'm not going to pretend it is." He looked at me then. Really looked at me for the first time. How did I not see it? 4 years, Mom. 4 years of marriage, and I had no idea who she really was. She was very good at hiding. Your father didn't see it either. Not until it was almost too late. But you did. You knew something was wrong. I could tell, even though you never said anything. Why didn't you say something? It was the question I'd been dreading. Because I was afraid of losing you. Because every time I tried to express concerns about Vivian, you got defensive. Because I convinced myself that maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was just being an overprotective mother who couldn't accept that her son had grown up. You should have told me. Yes, I should have. And I will regret that silence for the rest of my life. We sat together in that messy hotel room, mother and son, both of us broken by the same woman. Julian cried. I held him like I hadn't held him since he was a child, and he let me. Whatever distance had grown between us over the years, whatever walls we'd built, they crumbled in that moment. "What happens now?" he finally asked. "Now we let the legal system do its work. Now we grieve for your father properly. And now we start rebuilding what's left. I don't know how to do that. Neither do I. But we'll figure it out together." The trial was set for 6 months later, but it never actually happened. Faced with the mountain of evidence from multiple states, faced with the testimony of Danny Fiorello and the documentation Harrison had gathered, faced with the certainty of conviction, Vivian's attorneys negotiated a plea deal. She would plead guilty to the murder of Harrison Blackwell and the attempted murder of me in exchange for prosecutors in other states agreeing not to seek the death penalty. She would receive life in prison without the possibility of parole. I was in the courtroom the day she entered her plea. She looked different without her careful makeup and designer clothes, smaller somehow, less intimidating. The prison jumpsuit washed out her complexion, and her hair had grown out to show dark roots beneath the expensive blonde. When she said the word guilty, her voice was steady. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at Julian, who sat beside me with his jaw clenched. She stared straight ahead, her face empty of expression. But as they led her away, she glanced back. Just for a second, our eyes met, and in that moment, I saw something I hadn't expected. Not hatred, not defiance, resignation. She knew she'd lost, and she'd accepted it. I didn't feel the satisfaction I'd expected. There was no triumph in watching a woman be led away in chains, even a woman who had killed my husband and tried to kill me. There was only exhaustion and grief, and the hollow awareness that no amount of justice could bring Harrison back. After the hearing, Julian and I walked out of the courthouse together. The press was waiting, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. We didn't answer any of them. We just walked to the car, got in, and drove away. "It's over," Julian said. "The legal part is over," I agreed. "The rest of it, the healing, that's going to take longer." He nodded. We drove in silence for a while, watching the Connecticut countryside roll past the windows. "Mom?" "Yes?" "I'm sorry for defending her, for choosing her over you, for not seeing what was right in front of me." I reached over and took his hand. "You were manipulated by someone who was very skilled at manipulation. That's not your fault. I should have been smarter. You should have been loved by someone who was capable of love. That's the tragedy here, Julian. Not that you were fooled, but that you gave your heart to someone who didn't have a heart to give back." He squeezed my hand. "I love you, Mom. I love you too, sweetheart. I always have. I always will." 1 year later, I stood at Harrison's grave on the anniversary of his death. The headstone was simple, just the way he would have wanted. His name, his dates, and the words, "Beloved husband and father." Nothing about his business achievements or his family legacy. Just the truth of who he was to the people who loved him. I laid a single white rose against the granite. "We did it," I said quietly. "She's never going to hurt anyone again." The wind rustled through the trees of the cemetery, and for a moment I could almost imagine Harrison standing beside me, his hand on my shoulder, his voice in my ear. But he wasn't there. He would never be there again. That was the reality I'd had to learn to live with. Grief, I'd discovered, doesn't follow a timeline. There were days when I felt almost normal, when I could go hours without thinking about what I'd lost. And there were days when the weight of his absence pressed down on me so heavily I could barely breathe. The therapist I'd started seeing after the trial said this was normal. Healing wasn't linear. I just had to keep moving forward, one day at a time. The foundation was up and running now. The Harrison and Eleonora Blackwell Foundation, dedicated to supporting victims of financial abuse and domestic manipulation. It felt right to turn something terrible into something good, to take the money Vivienne had tried to steal and use it to help people who had been victimized the way we had been. I'd hired a full-time director, a woman named Sandra who had escaped an abusive marriage 20 years ago and had dedicated her life to helping others do the same. She understood the complexity of these situations, how smart people could be manipulated by skilled predators, how shame kept victims silent, how recovery required patience and compassion. Under her leadership, the foundation was already helping dozens of families. Marcus was back at the house, though not as a driver. I'd promoted him to head of household security, a position I'd created specifically for him. He oversaw a small team now, people he'd personally vetted, people he trusted. More importantly, he had his dignity back. The accusations against him had been formally cleared, his record expunged of the false charges. He'd even started dating someone, a woman he'd met at church, and I'd never seen him happier. Julian was doing better, though better was a relative term. He'd moved back to the Greenwich estate after the trial, staying in his childhood bedroom while he figured out his next steps. The divorce from Vivienne had been finalized quickly, given the circumstances. He'd started therapy, something I'd been suggesting for years, but that he'd always resisted. Now he went twice a week and was slowly unpacking the patterns that had made him vulnerable to someone like Vivian. Our relationship was healing too. We had dinner together most nights, real conversations instead of the polite small talk that had characterized our interactions for so many years. He told me about his childhood, about feeling abandoned when we sent him to boarding school, about the loneliness he'd carried into adulthood. I told him about my regrets, my worries, my wish that I could go back and do things differently. We couldn't change the past, but we could build something new. I've been thinking about leaving the firm, Julian told me one evening, about 8 months after the trial. We were sitting on the terrace, watching the sunset over the Long Island Sound. Dad's legacy and all that, I know. But every time I walk into that building, I think about him. And I don't want to spend my whole life living in his shadow. What would you do instead? He hesitated. I've been talking to Sandra at the foundation. She needs legal help, someone to handle the pro bono cases for victims who can't afford attorneys. It wouldn't pay much, but it would mean something. I looked at my son, at the uncertainty in his eyes, and I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Purpose, direction, a desire to do something meaningful with his life instead of just accumulating wealth and status. Your father would be proud, I said. Julian's eyes filled with tears. You think so? I know so. He always wanted you to find your own path. He just didn't always know how to say it. 2 weeks later, Julian resigned from Blackwell & Associates and started working with the foundation. The transformation in him was remarkable. He came home tired but fulfilled, talking about the families he was helping, the cases he was building, the difference he was making. For the first time since childhood, my son seemed genuinely happy. As for me, I was learning to live again. Not the life I'd planned, not the future Harrison and I had imagined together, but a life nonetheless. I traveled, something I'd always put off for someday. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected during the years of building my career and raising my family. I even started painting again, a hobby I'd abandoned decades ago, finding unexpected peace in the simple act of putting color on canvas. There were still hard days. There would always be hard days. But there were good days too. Days when I could look at my life and feel grateful for what I had instead of devastated by what I'd lost. On the anniversary of Harrison's death, after I left the cemetery, I drove to the prison where Vivian was serving her sentence. I hadn't planned to go inside, just to see the place where she would spend the rest of her life. But when I got there, I found myself walking through the security checkpoint, filling out the visitor forms, sitting in the cold waiting room until they called my name. She looked older than she should have. Prison had aged her in ways that surprised me. The sharp beauty that had been her primary weapon was fading, replaced by something harder and more worn. She sat across from me, separated by thick glass, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. "Why are you here?" she finally asked. I'd asked myself the same question during the drive. The answer, when it came, was simpler than I'd expected. Closure. She laughed, a bitter sound. There's no such thing. Maybe not. But I needed to see you. I needed to understand. Understand what? Why I did it. She leaned forward, her eyes flat and cold. Because I could. Because I was tired of being poor, of being nothing, of watching people like you have everything while I had nothing. Your husband was just another mark. So was your son. So were you. I should have felt anger. I should have felt hatred. But looking at her, all I felt was pity. This woman had spent her entire life taking from others, and now she had nothing. No family, no freedom, no future. Just decades of empty days in a concrete box. I'm not going to give you the satisfaction of my anger, I said quietly. You've taken enough from me already. I stood up to leave. But before I went, I said one more thing. Harrison saw through you. In the end, he saw exactly what you were. And he made sure you would never hurt anyone again. That's his legacy. Not the money, not the business. The fact that he protected his family, even when he knew it might cost him his life. For the first time, something flickered in Vivian's eyes. Not remorse exactly, but something close to it. I walked out of the prison and into the sunlight. The air smelled like autumn, like dying leaves and wood smoke and the promise of winter. I got in my car and drove home, back to the house I'd shared with Harrison, back to the life I was still building. That night, Julian and I had dinner together. Marcus joined us, along with his new girlfriend. Elena. We talked and laughed and remembered Harrison, the good times and the bad, the man he'd been, and the love he'd left behind. At the end of the evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I stood alone in Harrison's study. I touched the wedding photo on the wall, traced the outline of his face with my finger. "Thank you," I whispered, "for loving me, for protecting me, for giving me the tools to protect myself." Then I turned off the light and went upstairs to bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new sorrows, but I would face them the way I'd faced everything else in my life, with steady hands, with clear eyes, and with the knowledge that I was, and always had been, stronger than anyone gave me credit for, including myself.